Hi and good morning. As the time comes for many NHS trusts to update their green plans in line with the NHS's concerted drive towards a net zero carbon service, how many are in fact on track to deliver the stated objectives? This morning, in a webinar held in conjunction with Health Estate Journal, of which I'm the editor, Energy Management and Sustainability Consultancy, Enenco, which has considerable expertise in this field, will address this pressing subject. The webinar will cover topics including what has changed since 2022, how in general do trusts seem to be doing, some examples of best practice, how best to unlock progress, lessons learned so far in engaging with the supply chain, which is obviously going to be a major element of this, and how trusts should best approach updating their green plans. The webinar this morning will be led by Enenco's Senior Account Manager and Public Sector Specialist, Beth Fleetwin, who has extensive experience in this area, having worked with many trusts to identify the right energy procurement strategy, optimize their energy consumption, chart a path to carbon net zero, and advise trusts on putting together and implementing an effective green plan. If you have any questions as the webinar progresses, please type them into the panel on the right of the screen, and at the end of the presentation, Beth will answer as many of the questions as she can within the time allowed. As explained, her presentation will include a section on examples of best practice to date, focusing on particular on work trusts have undertaken in the two areas of sustainable models of care and food and nutrition. We're, however, keen to make this an interactive session, so if you have your own examples of good practice and would like to highlight them, please feel free to give brief detail in the same chat box on the right of the screen, and time allowing, we'll then discuss some of the most notable. I'm sure you'll find this an informative and valuable session. Over to you, Beth.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. You won't have seen my face for a little while. I've been on maternity leave for the last year, so this is my first webinar back. And one of the things I wanted to do when I got back was sort of touch base on where people are with green plans, what's going on. And I've been doing quite a lot of digging into that over the last few months and few weeks. So the first thing I wanted to do is sort of give you a what's changed since 2022. So what you're going to see is a little bit around what's been going on in terms of legislation and things. Then we're going to go into how do trusts seem to be doing. What are we seeing? Are we seeing good progress? Are we seeing that people are struggling? We're going to go into the best practice, as Jonathan says, and then how to unlock progress, some hints and tips, lessons that we've seen in engaging with supply chain, and then again, how to best approach updating your plans. So the main thing that's changed is on the next slide, which is the Health Act. So what you will see is that delivering a net zero National Health Service document has now become statutory guidance via the Health and Care Act 2022. This is a little snippet from the Act. It's quite a large document. So if you've not seen this particular bit of it, it's excusable. But it does have a huge impact on how you need to look at sustainability within the NHS. So the targets within it here make it a legal requirement for an NHS trust to contribute towards compliance of the Climate Change Act 2008 and Section 5 of the Environment Act 2021. It also means that you must adapt to any current or predicted impacts of climate change that are in the report under the Climate Change Act 2008. It sounds really simple, this. It isn't. There's quite a lot behind those acts and there's quite a lot of interpretation in there. So what the NHS has done is actually move forward and make it statutory guidance to meet the delivering a net zero National Health Service document requirements. And this is what was in there. So you must be net zero by 2040 for your NHS carbon footprint, with an ambition for an 80% reduction by 2028-32. That's really not very far away. And you must be net zero plus by 2045 with an 80% reduction aim there between 2036 and 39. So what that means is that essentially you are now bound by this. You have to do this. It is statutory guidance. that makes it a much bigger stick, essentially, that you can be hit with, which means it needs a lot more focus than it maybe previously had. So what you can see is that the document, if you go into it, actually includes figures with some rough ideas of how to meet the targets. It gives you some broad things to focus on, and it informs what should be captured within your green plans and feeds into the section headers you should be addressing. So if you go back and have a look at that document, oh, sorry, if you go back a slide, if you go back and have a look at that document and look at the graphs that we've referenced there, so the figures under each of these, which show how to achieve those targets as far as the NHS are concerned, you'll see that they roughly fit into the sections of your green plan. That was done on purpose. And what you can see is that actually your green plan is the strategy that you are creating to meet the requirements of this net zero NHS statutory guidance. So it's very much should be a working strategy document for the trust. And I'm not sure whether they've been viewed as that before. So that's my very brief recap on what's changed and why are green plans back on my agenda already. We're a year and a half into the first 3-year green plan. So all trusts had to publish your first green plan, and we're now a year and a half into that time period. So that means you need to be starting to understand where you're going to go next. You need to understand whether you're going to hit your targets. You need to create your annual plan update ready for the final year's rollout. And you need to be getting ready to explain your successes and your failures to your local ICS, who are tasked with holding organisations within their system to account. And I know that all of you are receiving questionnaires and receiving queries from the ICS about whether you've hit certain targets already. So yeah, now is the time that you need to start thinking about what your next green plan is going to look like, learning the lessons from this period of time so that you can drive your progress next time around, which is actually the time period of 2025 to 26 through to 27-28 financial years. Thanks very much. So how in general do trusts seem to be doing? It is a difficult question to assess because we don't see public reports on progress against the green plan from many trusts. These aren't something that we've found easy to access. And there's probably something here to say that the trust that's under the highest scrutiny is Newcastle, because they were leaders in declaring a climate emergency. And they have more ambitious targets than those that they're being legally held to. So they've been under a microscope throughout the whole process of this, and they've always been very open about where they are and what challenges they're facing. They had a recent board meeting and published some minutes which talk about the challenges that they're facing themselves. They have a risk entry for climate emergency, which is something that I encourage all trusts to do. Highlighting climate emergency and the need to adapt as a risk is really crucial in getting that momentum behind it, and that framework to then use it and see it and manage it as a risk will help to give it more weight to senior managers and across the broad areas of your trust. It highlights in this report that the trust is currently overshooting their carbon budget and are not on track to achieve their net zero 2030 target for their NHS carbon footprint. I don't think that's a surprise. I don't think it's a surprise to them or to anyone, but what it does is really drive the fact that things need to change. And the things that have been highlighted that they've identified as problems is a lack of dedicated capacity, which is failure to recruit and stakeholder departments needing to have personnel so it's not all falling within one department, and a lack of dedicated finance, needing to actually ring fence capital funding and ring fence budget for sustainability. There's also, of course, the energy market, which I'm not going to touch on. Everyone understands that the energy market has thrown a lot of this out of the water by changing people's focus away from sustainability and onto cost. And that's something that we just have to work around. So I want to commend the clarity and the transparency of having a document that's visible in the public domain that's talking about the challenges we're facing. I think that story's echoed across all acute, community and mental health trusts, with like a countrywide lack of resourcing going on, both personnel and financial. The energy market challenges have stripped the time that existing personnel in post did have to dedicate to sustainability. It's forced boards to spend that time on cost pressures in their estates budgets rather than thinking about finding new money for other things. And while we've seen great case studies coming out of pilot programs, in general, my view is that trusts are not making as much progress as they had the aspiration to in their original green plans. And that's going to be a big problem if we see it continue going forwards. So rather than be doom and gloom, as you can see, the next thing I wanted to talk about is best practice. And I'm hoping that some of you have got some examples of this that you want to share with the group as well. I'm going to circle back to those key blocker points later when it comes to unlocking progress. But I want to talk about the great things that we have seen trusts doing over the last year and a half. And you guys are a big part of that. So if there's something that you want to shout about, want to say that your trust has done really well, do put something in there. We do want to highlight that. For me, the thing I wanted to start with is sustainable models of care. I'm starting with this because I think it's outside of the remit of a lot of the people who are likely on the call. I'm assuming we still have mostly people from estates departments, maybe dedicated sustainability departments if we're lucky, who are on this call. And obviously models of care is one that you're going to find quite challenging to get involved with. And there may be people in your trust that are doing things in here that you're not necessarily hearing from. The thing that I wanted to highlight first, actually you will see on the Greener NHS website, but I think it warrants a shout out here as well, which is an operating theatre at the University Hospitals of Birmingham, who decided to attempt to create the lowest emissions possible from an operation. So it's just a single test case. They thought, we'll see if we do everything we know about now that we can't implement day to day on every single surgery, but we know that we could be aiming towards, how much of a reduction of the carbon impact of surgery can we make? So that included things like reusable gowns, drapes, scrub caps, using intravenous anesthesia, which I know a lot of your trusts are already moving to, implementing a plan so that the electricity use was minimised, including the heating and the lighting, so time of day being impacted here, recycling single-use equipment used in surgery, and recycling clean paper and plastic waste, using individually packed equipment so that there was no wastage from spares, and even they went to the extent of looking at surgeons' travel, with the surgeons coming to hospital either by foot or on bicycle. So that's a huge undertaking from them, to just test and see what could be done. And they achieved reductions of 80% of the carbon that they would usually see as being an impact from that surgery. That's really impressive. And it's probably something that we should be looking at as something to aim at, or certainly to target a 50% reduction over the next course of a green plan. Because if it's possible already to hit 80%, we should be aiming to hit somewhere in that region, and aiming to look at ways we can do that consistently so that it becomes normal day-to-day practice. We've also seen that a lot of trusts have been moving to intravenous anesthesia. I mentioned that already. It's becoming standard practice in a lot of trusts, and looking at the gases as well, leak identifications where NOx is used, and looking at your NOx systems. That's one that previously wasn't even captured in your carbon footprints for a lot of time. And when it's been added in, certainly trusts with maternity units have seen massive spikes in their carbon footprint due to this, and have been looking at it in a lot of depth. So I'm really pleased with the things that have been being done in terms of gases. One of the other things that we look at and see happening really well is packaging changes. So on trusts where you're sending medications out, sending things with reusable bags, sending things where you're reducing the plastic wrapping on them. Also, this touches a little bit on your procurement side, looking at what packaging you're receiving from your suppliers, because a lot of suppliers have unnecessary packaging in there. Has anyone actually got an example of something else that's been done on sustainable models of care? Have we seen any come up, Jonathan?
Not yet, Beth. We've had some good and interesting questions, which we'll go on to. But I'd encourage participants in the webinar, if you have got good examples, to type in a brief description into the chat box that we've got, and we can talk about them. I mean, you've obviously talked about some interesting ones with Newcastle, the Newcastle upon Tyne Trust. I know particularly prominent, and I've also heard of some of the work on the clinical side that you're seeing. Do you think, I mean, presumably the involvement, a good liaison between clinical and estates teams is absolutely vital on this. Do you think you're seeing lots of examples of that?
We're seeing more examples, certainly, seeing more enthusiasm from clinical teams in terms of getting involved and wanting to be heard in terms of their sustainability knowledge. And certainly there's been big drives in anaesthetic gases for a few years where anaesthetists have been coming together outside of their trust's individual sustainability drives and looking for ways to do this themselves and looking for ways to put it into care models. And I think that's one of the things you'll see is it's a little disconnected. And what you really need is dedicated personnel in individual departments whose job is sustainability. So it's not an addition. It's not something you're relying on volunteers. You're relying on a person whose job is sustainability within that care planning part of your trust. I'll touch on it again later, definitely around personnel side of things. Okay, I'm going to jump onto food and nutrition. And this is something that I have seen a lot of progress on. And personally, as a person who has recently spent some time in hospital in the last year, food is quite high on my thought process because I have to say I was not hugely impressed with the food offerings and the waste that I saw just through a lack of communication with the people that you're meant to be helping here. So food waste processing, and this is something that's an absolute must. A way to actually have your food waste separated from other wastes and do something with it that reduces how much is going into landfill or incineration. The gold standard here is anaerobic digesters to produce gas. And I think all trusts really should be looking at right now. And I think you're getting the same message from your ICSs here. That's something that you really need to be looking at. But processing waste in the best possible way is not the goal. The goal is to reduce waste. And food waste reduction requires a level of consultation with patients that maybe trusts aren't used to. We need to be moving towards flexible solutions.
What sort of steps there might they be taking with patients in terms of food waste? Messages in staff restaurants, for instance? Or not staff restaurants, patient restaurants?
Yeah, so this is mostly around inpatients where patients are having food delivered to them. So there is now a move to go to a sort of an as and when needed system so that meal times aren't necessarily set. Patients can choose what they're wanting to eat and when they want to eat and essentially order from a kitchen, which will then send them their food, rather than a system previously in place, which would have been essentially you were brought what you were having at a particular time, which leads to food waste on the plate because it leads to food waste where people aren't available to eat at that time for whatever reason. They don't want to eat what they've been given. So you have food waste at the plate point, but you also have food waste at the point where it's being cooked because you're sending out to everyone, you're doing a bulk cook, and you're going to be left with some left over, particularly if you've not sent people an option to choose between a number of eating sort of options, a number of menus at the time. You're going to find people are choosing one when the cart comes around to their ward, and you might find that no one has chosen a particular meal that you've spent a lot of time cooking, a lot of resources cooking, and it all goes to waste. So that waste reduction, and I think moving to a system where patients are selecting, ideally on a digital system, what they want to eat, when they're available to eat, so that they're ordering it at the point where in an hour's time they're going to want to eat, because unpredictable things happen in hospitals. That's really crucial to reduce food waste, and there are trusts who are doing this now. This isn't me making up an idea. This is something that's been implemented in trusts already, and particularly your food suppliers. I know a lot of you in long-term catering contracts. This is something you should be talking to them about. Can they fulfill this alongside the other things for moving towards locally sourced food, seasonal menus? Something I really like here is actually the Food for Life Catering Awards. Some of you may have seen this. It's not NHS specific, but I would encourage you to have a look at these because they really give you some things to focus on in terms of how to make your food purchasing more sustainable. So that's a really great one to look at. The other thing is the new national standards. So there are now diabetes guidelines for retail food. So where you are talking about shops, Jonathan, like you said, what are we going to do in terms of choosing what people purchase? There are views on what you need to have in a shop to make sure that there is a healthy balance of food and that it's not just chocolate and crisps, which there is a lot of that going on historically. So a couple of things there.
There's quite a lot there really for people in estates either responsible for catering or working with external caterers to think about. And I guess one of the things here is technology helps. I know some nurse call systems now, I believe some patients can choose food through using those, but I guess that may require some investment in technology. But as you said, there are a lot of other options that require more consultation and thought and liaison between, say, an estates department and its external FM company.
Yeah, definitely. And this is where the interconnectedness of sustainability really comes in. So you can imagine the estates person may be your sustainability responsible person, essentially, up to board level. It might be that you've got a person in estates, they report into your board level sponsor for sustainability, and that might be it. But for food and nutrition, they have to go through the procurement team who need to look at the contract that you've got with your catering company and need to understand what's needed from the next catering contract and whether the existing one needs to be renegotiated. So that's all procurement. And then you've also got to look at digital transformation, and you're looking at your tech team in the background and looking at actually, how do we implement this? Can we implement this? Do we need to go away and procure a package to be able to implement this? Back into procurement. So when I'm talking about the fact that it's a problem where you've not got dedicated personnel in different departments, if you're just one person and your job role is sat within the estates department and you're focused on sustainability within estates, tackling food and nutrition is going to take up a significant portion of your time just to meet this one challenge. Whereas actually it might be better owned by a sustainability resource that sits within procurement.
Do you think a lot of these messages, though, need to come right from the top of the trust to make staff think about these areas? I mean, presumably where you have a board or a CEO who really has a focus on sustainability, that message can be transmitted down. And I think Newcastle is a very good example there.
Yeah, and I think it's about getting both. So you'll see that the NHS is focusing a target around training modules and an e-learning module that they've got that's come out around net zero for all staff members. And that's very much taken from the view of ground up. So making sure that there is ground up understanding of sustainability from everyone within a trust, which is really important. But if you don't have the structure at the top where you've got a person who's your board sponsor and they've put in place a set of dedicated people amongst different departments and they've got a regular meeting and they've got targets and goals they want to achieve, if you don't have that drive from the top and you've just got one person sat in the middle who is trying to do all of it and who's trying to push it, it's very challenging to actually make progress.
I can see all the points. One of the audience members has said, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but based on your experience, maybe offering food which is nice and edible would be a good idea with better menu options. Some hospital food is really good, but some offer poor food, and I'm sure that's the case. I'm sure there are some fantastic exemplars of good catering, and I've seen one or two in hospitals I've visited where estates teams have focused a lot of attention on quite low-cost measures, but to make food appetizing, and the restaurants are a great environment, but I'm sure there's more that can be done. We don't have any other examples of best practice that anybody's mentioned yet, but you may want to carry on that or move to the next section.
I will move to the next section, but before I do, whoever said that, thank you very much, because I have to say the only meal I managed to eat while I was in hospital was lunch, and that was a jacket potato, and everything else was inedible, and everything required me to go and purchase food from the M&S shop downstairs, which is an appalling situation to be in, particularly when you're trying to actually have good nutrition so that you can look after a young baby. So yeah, I think there's a lot that needs doing just on the base level of this before you get to best practice. So yeah, I'll talk a bit about how to unlock progress now. So if we go on to the next slide. And what you'll see here is I've got 2 slides on this one. So we'll start with resource, which is personnel and financial resource. So this is essentially a flip of the problems that we identified earlier that thankfully Newcastle identified for us, and I imagine all of you are familiar with. And what you're looking at here is how can we fix those? So probably the first thing here is that to unlock progress, you need engagement and strategic planning. So to create personnel resource, you need to have attractive job roles, you need training and promotion internally, and you need to make sure that sustainability roles are not just within the estates department. I know that all of these things are much easier said than done, by the way. I know that you're dealing with banding constraints and what you can actually offer to bring people into these roles, and issues even with being able to promote people internally because you can't record their training. I get all of that, but that is what needs to happen. And then from a financial perspective, you also need the highest level in your trust to understand that you cannot meet this statutory guidance, you cannot reach net zero unless you have a budget. And that means that the sustainability team has to control a budget. It needs a new budget creating. This is a big challenge, but if you've got a good board sponsor, this is something that they need to make happen. You can't do it yourself. It has to come from the top down. But if you've got a sustainability team that control a budget and you've got CapEx available to them, then you can start to actually move the needle a little bit on some of these things and make progress. It is a catch-22 because to get that, they need to understand what you're going to spend that budget on. And you probably don't have a costed set of actions right now that you want to take. So you've sort of got a problem here where you need to understand what you're going to do and what it's going to cost. And then you need to go and get the budget, but you also need the budget next year, and you're not going to get the budget next year. So you've got to try and find a way around that. And again, I know it's challenging. These are the things we need to overcome. And once you've unblocked things internally, that's not even the full story. So if we go on to the next slide, you also need to make sure that your plan is robust, and you know what to focus those human and financial resources onto. For that, you need expertise. So you can't get a budget without a list of actions that are budgeted for the financial year. You need to understand what they're going to cost. So you need to put together priorities, and costing them is a challenge. Essentially, in the long term, what you need here is a marginal abatement cost curve, which the NHS has had before. If you look it up, there's a historic one. Some of the things on there that were quick wins, some of you still won't have done. So definitely go back and look. A lot of it is out of date now, but it was actually a really useful piece of documentation that the NHS put out at the time. Or a costed carbon reduction roadmap. They're essentially the same thing, slightly different layouts, slightly different methodologies. The key message here is you need dates, paybacks, and costs. So it's usually outside of the expertise that you hold internally to do that. And it will require close interaction with your internal stakeholders who've got detailed knowledge of the sites, because you know your sites, but you might not have the ability to then translate that into actually costed plans of what you're going to do. The information required to build that full detail right now probably doesn't exist. And I am giving you a goal here that is probably out of reach right now. So it's your dedicated staff time and money has to go to the right place. That's critical. Where do you start? So I've put here a little bit of some things that I think you all should hit. And so if you start at the left and go across, you'll see sort of where you're going with them. You need to identify staff that are passionate and who champion sustainability already, and you need to start promoting them in their individual departments and making sustainability a part of their job role. You're going to have to do that in the same way that historically you've always grown staff and developed staff within the NHS, because the external pool of resource isn't available to you to hire necessarily. So you're going to have to pour into the people you've already got, who want to work within the NHS and really care about it. That training can start with the e-learning module, but realistically, you then need to focus on training them actually to become higher level within their teams, training them in more detail around how to actually manage sustainability change. Your existing green plan also should have included some sensible targets for you to focus on as quick wins, and so does the ICS document that you keep being asked about. It gives you some things that you can start with right now, and that's what I would suggest that you put in for next year. So those things where you've got quick wins you identified at the start of your green plan but you haven't achieved yet, or the things that the ICS are asking you about on your surveys, those need transforming into targets for the last year of your green plan, which starts in April. And you need to start thinking about the practicalities of how you're going to achieve as many of those as you can in that year, so that when you're reporting back, it's a good story, not a negative story. And then what I would suggest you also look at in terms of funding requests, whether that's to hire someone internally who can do these things for you, whether it's looking at external consultancy for individual projects, whether you need someone who can essentially guide you through all of this process, and you're looking at external sustainability support, which is also possible. Whatever mode it takes within your trust, you need to be looking at having carbon footprint done. So annually, this should be something you're doing as standard. Your NHS carbon footprint should be being run. And I know that the NHS have centrally done some of these, but my recommendation would be to do them to industry standards for that footprint, and to do them yourselves, because you know the site better than anyone can get from data. You need to look at building fabric assessments, understanding what the buildings on your site actually are made of and how leaky are they, and whether you're going to be able to actually bring those along on the journey with you. Electrical capacity assessments, so you understand what connection you've got, whether actually your network on site needs upgrading, whether your off-site supply is going to be able to handle what your demand's going to be, at least understand what its capability is. You need to try and build what I would call a green buildings asset register. It's got a lot of different names. It's essentially a database with every site you've got, every building you've got, and then all of the information that you need summarized on them, so that at a glance you can look at your estate and you can understand, this building on this site is awful. Are we able to knock it down? Are we able to get rid of it? Do we have to do a full refurb of it? What about the rest of the estate on that rest of the site? You need to be able to understand within that what the building fabric is, so give it a score. Whether it's got new mechanical vent, whether it's got new plumbing. It's essentially building a single place where you can look at the whole of your estate. And that's really important for you to do, so that someone can actually assess where you're going, because your next estate plan is going to need to understand whether you've got things you need to offload, whether you need to buy other sites, whether you need to be looking at significant refurb and refit. And you can't really write your next estates plan, estate strategy, without having a green buildings asset register. Next, climate change risk assessments and adaptation plans. Adaptation is now a significant part of that legal requirement. So if you don't understand what your risk is from climate change, you're not going to be able to fulfill that legal requirement. So you need to do a climate change risk assessment for every site. That includes flood risk, because there's a problem here that a number of NHS sites might actually be impacted by local flooding. And then everything else you're going to do on that site becomes irrelevant unless you can stop them from being flooded. The same with your capture area, your service capture area. If most of the people who currently are your service users are going to be underwater in 10 years, there's not a lot of point in you investing in that site. you need to understand these things. You also need to understand how your demand's going to change with the heat changing. And then finally, sustainability assessments. So the UN Sustainability Goals is the gold standard here. Those were actually really well captured in the old SStat tool. And that's still referenced in this year's sustainability reporting guidance for the public sector as being the tool the NHS use. I know it's offline. I know that we're looking to move to other things that are simpler. But if you do actually have a look at this, you'll find it's incredibly useful for building your green plan. It has a huge amount of things that you can actually look at as suggestions to start with, and it allow you to set some targets without having to think too detailed about what they're going to be. Okay, so that's a whole load of data you're trying to get in next year. So all of that is around trying to bring in information so that when you're writing your next green plan, the targets you're setting are based on a solid foundational knowledge. And that is really what I think you need to be aiming for from the rest of this green plan. Get to a point where you've made some progress on some key things, but where you also have a much higher level of understanding than you did when you wrote the last green plan. After that, it's looking at planning heat decarbonisation, planning investment grade audit cases for individual projects, and then the footprint problem. But for now, focusing on having a baseline that you understand is really crucial. And you need to get to that point before you're writing your next green plan, or you've already put yourself on the back foot for your next green plan. Deep breath, and then we're going to have a look at supply chain, if that's all right with everyone, which is the next section. So if we look at the next slide, the supply chain challenge. This is an interesting one. I'm sure some of you have seen. Oh, sorry, before we did that, if we nip back, I didn't show you the costed carbon footprint. If you just nip back another slide, sorry. I forgot I'd put an example of this in here, and it's probably a useful thing for you to see. This is what the end goal looks like. Sorry, one forward from that. Yes, that one, the example roadmap to net zero. This is an example of an end goal. So this is a summary of a much larger document on a single page, which essentially shows you all of the different things you need to do. So you can see renewable electricity, LED lighting, chiller heat recovery. These are all really simple things. This isn't based around an NHS trust, obviously, but it shows you sort of how to move the goalposts. And what you'll find is those first things on there are probably very much mirroring how the NHS model shows you with the step 1 box. All of those things are going to be your first targets. But yeah, this should then take you all the way to the point where you reach net zero, and it should have some contingency in there to overshoot. So this is a roadmap to net zero, a fully costed one. A MAC curve would be the other way around, essentially showing a reduction and showing the same data but in a different way. Thanks very much for that. I'd forgotten that I'd put that in to show people. So if we move on now and we move on to the supply chain. Supply chain challenge is a huge challenge, and the whole of the second part of your target for net zero on the statutory guidance is about your supply chain. So at Enenco, we are an NHS supplier. We are your supply chain, and so we see what you're doing, and we see how you're engaging with suppliers at the moment. My understanding is that there are only 3 suppliers who have engaged with us at all about where we are on our net zero journey. That's really not great considering how many NHS trusts we work with. There are some exemplary sort of versions of this, engagement with suppliers, local webinars on a regular basis so that they are communicating with the supply chain on what you're going to do in future years. We've actually seen one of the trusts that we work with who have reached out to their entire supply chain, everyone who's a supplier, to ask them what awareness they have about the net zero supplier roadmap and where they are in terms of progress. So if we go to the next slide, when I started drafting this webinar, I was going to say to you, in 4 months' time, any supplier that you want to procure from needs to have a CRC in the government's PPN 0621 format. And I was going to ask you, do you know which suppliers are going to meet that? And the sort of answer I was expecting is no. Now, this message has obviously made its way back up the chain to the central team, because the wording has been softened. So you can see the two versions here of the wording. We've pulled these direct from the documents. So previously, you needed to have a carbon reduction plan in the government's format from every supplier for every procurement as of April coming. You don't anymore. It's still going to be the aim, it's still where we're going, but I think what's been seen from the central team is that no one really was ready for it. And that hadn't made progress. Unfortunately, that means that trusts who had made progress with this have spent a lot of time on something that then has sort of had the rug pulled out from underneath it. But the positive here is that this is going to benefit you. So trusts who've done this work already, don't feel like you've wasted your time, because actually this starts you further down the journey to hitting that target, because you need to have your suppliers aware of where their carbon is, what their plans are to reach net zero, and how to align with your plans. Otherwise, you can't hit your target. So yeah, it's something with moving goalposts, but something that I wanted to shout out about here in terms of positive things that have happened off the back of that goal that everyone was supposed to be going towards. Embedding sustainability into business cases internally. There's a really good guide with this in a long read on the NHS website, which I've put a link to in the bottom of this presentation, so you'll be able to have a look at that on your own. It's starting with embedding carbon cost into your decision making, and then looping it into quali years. And that's something that your procurement teams are already really well versed in. So starting to pull that in and understand the impact of carbon emissions into your procurement is really crucial, and it is not that challenging. It is challenging, but if you've got a dedicated person whose job is sustainability within your procurement department, it's less challenging. And that will help to ensure that it's monitored and measured across all procurement. That's definitely something you need to move towards. And I would still encourage you to ask your suppliers now, have they got these reduction plans, and what format do they take, and what targets are they meeting? It can't hurt to ask and to capture that data, and just make them aware that you are going to need them to start looking at this, and that is going to be something that will impact on your procurement decisions going forwards. Okay, final section coming, which is how should trusts best approach updating the plans. I've got a single slide on this one if we move forward to it. So the first question here is to ask yourself, where are you right now? If your initial green plan included an assessment that was linked to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and a carbon footprint, and it looked at all areas of the trust, you've probably got a reasonable level of understanding of where you are now. This is a model we use not just within the NHS. This is a model we use with all of our private sector clients. It's very adaptable, but essentially this is the track you follow. Do you understand? Can you prepare? How do you develop the plans? How are you going to implement the plans, and how are you going to monitor the plans? And those last three almost become a little circle, to be honest, because for every plan, you're developing something, you're implementing it, you're monitoring it, and then you're going to develop something new off the back, or you're at least going to implement something new off the back. So they're not a bookend. An annual update of everything is crucial. It feels like a cost. It feels like something of, oh, well, why do I need to understand how much my footprint has moved in the last year? It can't be that much of an impact. Why do I need to understand how much sustainability progress we've made against the targets we set this year? That's going to take a huge amount of resource and time internally that I don't have in order to get an understanding of it. We set goals, they must be being delivered. Or we set goals, that's enough, we hit our obligation. But it isn't. You really have to have understanding, and you have to continue to have understanding. So expanding on this means adding in all those things I talked about earlier, that big list of things, shopping list of understanding your estate, and getting to the point where you have a single database where you can look at a snapshot of everything on your estate and understand where it is on the sustainability journey. That is the thing you need to do next, and the thing that will help to pull everything in to understand where you can tick that off and say, I understand my estate, and all I've got to do annually is just update some of these things and just check in with them, and put that structure in place. So a lot of it is focused on estates here, and I'm going to go to adaptation for a minute to talk about that, because as you saw, it's become a significant legal focus, adaptation. We're expecting an updated health effects of climate change report this year, and that's going to give you a whole lot more information around what you should be focusing on adaptation to meet the new requirements. And my main takeaway from the existing documents is essentially risk to health and social care delivery is as a medium to high risk on the current documents. So social care delivery is identified as being at risk from climate change now. The first priorities are essentially flood risk assessments of all sites, mitigation if it's possible, flood risk assessments for your client catchment areas, which I talked about earlier, resilience to heat wave conditions, and extreme weather events. So you're talking about water, you're talking about heat here, and understanding how those things are likely to change locally. Some of that's going to involve you talking to your local councils about what they're doing on flood defences. It's not going to be a quick, easy fix, but at least you can start to get an understanding of where you're at. And the asset register will help you to capture this and actually assess whether you're going to continue to have areas of your estate or whether they're not going to be viable in a certain period of time. And that's definitely something you need to do straight away. Pulling back away from adaptation, prepare, the second stage on this. I suspect a lot of you that are further along and feel like you've done a good job with your first green plans are in prepare. I think maybe some of you are in the develop stage just a little bit, but you're probably mostly in the prepare stage. It's planning. This is using the information you've got, incorporating all of that data and starting to look at what you're going to keep. This is your next estate strategy, or it's your next strategy for sustainability within care. It does translate to other areas, but just keeping within estates for a minute. It's understanding how you're going to solve the personnel and financial resourcing problems we talked about. It's having a plan for that. It's considering your care pathways and what your HR team are offering in terms of training. Have they even got an HR system that can record CPDs in a sector that isn't clinical? And I suspect if you go away and ask them, the answer is no, because the majority of the ones I've spoken to, the HR team have no way to record environmental sustainability CPD, and that really needs to change. There's hundreds and hundreds of guide questions on the old SSTAT tool, which will give you a way to probe what you need to prepare and what you should be targeting to improve and give you that start of that preparation, or just looking at the simplistic ones and talking internally to your staff and who's got ideas. Getting the supply chain ready. Again, we've talked about that. Planning is a really in-depth thing for an NHS trust, and it would not surprise me if you're halfway through your next green plan before you're fully into develop. There will be things that you will have implemented and monitored within that. There will be areas where you're a lot further along, but develop requires you to actually have a full map of everything you're going to do, and that is a big ask. And we understand that that's a big ask. It's probably a 5-year goal to get you to the point where you have a map to hit the NHS targets, and you're already going to be very close to them at that point. So the faster you can do these things, the more you can actually tick the boxes, understand it, prepare, and get to a point where you've got a map, the better. If you can do that before the end of this green plan, you're going to be well on the way to hitting your targets. Implementation and monitoring, I'm not going to go into detail on this. A lot of you understand IPMVP already. If you don't, make sure that if you're delivering a project that you're monitoring to see whether it's actually delivering what it promised. It helps you to push back on suppliers. It also helps you to ring fence the money saved to use it on future projects. That's as far as I'm going to go into that one, because I can see that we've not got a huge amount of time. So I'm going to wrap up, and I'm just going to say that your next green plan needs to be approved and issued ahead of April 2025. and that doesn't actually feel very far away if you look at what you need to do by then. You need to be as far into the planning as possible, as far into prepare, with some projects implemented already and proven that you can include as case studies, and with detailed targets and realistic timelines behind that public document, not necessarily publicly visible, but it needs to be agreed and signed off as a budget year on year by the board alongside the plan. This can't just be a woolly strategy document anymore. This needs to become a working document that you are constantly referring to as a guide. And that's me going to stop and say, questions?
Thank you very much, Beth. That was an excellent presentation. In fact, quite a lot of the questions that have come up, I think you've actually answered as the webinar's gone on. It's clear to me that one of the big issues is personnel resource in dealing with this, and having the right sort of champions and also people dedicated to sustainability initiatives within different disciplines and departments, including clinical. Do you think that enough focus is being put on this by trusts at the moment? Because obviously they're dealing with a lot of other issues, particularly clinical backlog and dealing with that and the estate's implications. Do you think trusts are putting enough focus on this now?
No, I don't. I don't think that that's their fault. I think the personnel who are in post who are responsible for some of this definitely do care and are focused on it as much as they are able to with the time available to them. It all comes back to lack of resource. And it really does come back to the fact that you cannot expect a single individual within an estates team to manage your sustainability progress as a trust. Every trust requires a network of people who are involved in this. And yeah, that's really where you need to get to. It has to be within each department, there is someone who is pushing their department on sustainability.
And how much more do you think effort and drive needs to go into highlighting the benefits and the job role in sustainability and trust? Do you think that's a big part of what the NHS needs to do?
I think it does. I think a lot of people understand the benefits. Working within sustainability isn't for everyone. And I'll refer back to something some of you may have heard me talk about before, which is when I did my degree, on the first day of my degree, which was economics and ecology with environmental management involved, which included a lot of how are you actually going to get people to change things. This is 15 years ago. The first day of my degree, they said by the end of this course, probably most of you will have depression. And they opened their degree course with that, because sustainability is not an easy place to work. It requires you to have resolve to come back into yourself and say, okay, I've not achieved it this year. Next year, I'm going to hit it. So you need to find those people. You need to identify them within the teams you've already got. And some of that is going to be offering people the chance to take up training and seeing who says yes. And just seeing who's going, I'm going to put my hand up here. I want to learn and I want to develop within this, and then bringing them up to promote them. But you are going to have to upskill them hugely as well along the way.
So there needs to be a focus and sufficient budget to train people in this area, because with the best will in the world, they may have some knowledge, but they're going to need expert training. Somebody's also asked, do you think the sustainability team in a trust needs a strong and experienced financial commercial resource? I guess that's a bit of really, it speaks to what you've been talking about as well.
It does, and it's an absolute yes. And I think you need someone, not just within procurement, but within that team that is looking at budget, has to have sustainability understanding, because everything needs to be assessed with it in mind. Your risk backlog needs to account for, is this going to actually promote our sustainability goals, or actually this piece of equipment that we're about to spend a load of money replacing, is it in a building that in 3 years time we don't want? That kind of full understanding, yet you need someone who understands financial, commercial, and how to motivate people as well.
Thanks. Somebody's asked a particular question against one of the slides, which was against each of your resource expertise hexagons, is there a list of publicly available standards to measure each against?
No. So those hexagons are individual items of things that I've identified based on what we do. They're based on like individual projects, essentially, that we view as part of a larger model. They are not necessarily NHS specific. It is something where if you look actually at the PSDS fund, for example, a number of these items that I've put in those hexagons are actually within that as part of heat decarb plans. You need to have done this, 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 this. They're industry acceptable terms that I've used essentially, but there aren't standards that I can point you to measure against on them, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Another question is, you've put renewable electricity as a net zero measure, and the questioner has merely said, we reported at grid average, question mark.
Yeah, you do. You report as the grid, as your carbon from your electricity. Now, the renewable electricity question is a bigger one than I think we have time to actually dig into, but I would like to get into it at some point, so it might be something for a future webinar. There are a lot of questions at the moment as to whether paying for regos is a good use of money, and I do lean towards the view that it isn't. At the moment, and that money would be better spent elsewhere. I'm sure, Alex, you and I could have a chat about that for a really long time, but I will leave it for a later webinar.
There's another question. Any idea how much the average sustainability plan is saving trusts? Must be a difficult one to answer given the variety of different trusts and size of estate.
Yeah, it is, and no one seems to have the financial data behind it. It's not something that I'm seeing. So there's very little costing going into this in either direction in terms of what is something going to cost us and how is it going to save us money in the future. I'm just not seeing it from people. The average sustainability plan in general that's going to get you to net zero will not have an overall cost saving. For most trusts, there will be a cost implication for meeting this statutory guidance and actually hitting these targets. That's not to say that your next 3-year plan can't make you savings. It probably can, because a lot of those things still will actually deliver savings at this point. A lot of people are still in quick wins, but some of the bigger pieces are not actually going to save money.
Thank you. I mean, we've talked about this, and I think you addressed the fact that for trusts to meet net zero objectives, they're going to need to involve a wide range of departments and areas. Somebody said on that, with sustainability teams often as part of estates teams, is this a limiting factor when trying to address overall trust carbon footprints, where the other big numbers are in other areas, i.e. not building related?
Yes. Again, this is an easy yes from me. It's a big problem. It's something we talked about before the first wave of green plans came out, that you needed to have people in every department who were engaged with this. And it's still a problem we have now, even in the trusts we work with, who we would view as quite a long way along this journey, to actually get engagement from other teams to tell us what they've been doing and to let us help and let the sort of estates team direct them on certain things as to what to target is definitely a limiting factor. Carbon footprint is mostly impacted by estates and gases. So the actual carbon net zero targets themselves, the NHS footprint ones, predominantly sit within limited areas, which makes it a little easier to focus on. But the NHS footprint plus is your whole trust. And that is where we've got a big problem in terms of actually being able to make progress.
Thank you. Another question, how do your priorities overlap with the Greener NHS team and ICS priority actions?
Yeah, so there's a huge overlap here with the things I've talked about. Some of you who are filling in these will have seen the thing about the e-learning module and what percentage of your staff have completed it. You'll understand sort of who's got responsibility, and you've got individual things that they're trying to have you sort of start to do. These are going to expand, these are going to increase, but at the moment I think the things I've talked about here align pretty well with the kinds of questions you're going to be asked. There are some specific things in random areas, so for example digital transformation, really pushing you to have low CO2 data centers for external hosting. And those specific things I've not really dug into. because to me, they're just individual targets within a wider goal. And that's part of your planning, to actually sort of say, okay, we're going to hit this target as quickly as possible. And what I would say is the questions you're being asked from your ICS at the moment are short-term goals. They're going to be looking for progress on this by the end of next year. You really need to be focusing on them as quick wins. What I'm trying to talk to you about a little bit is a little bit longer term, and I'm hoping that that message is coming across, that you can't just focus on the quick wins. You've got to also be planning for how you're going to meet the targets.
Presumably going forward, the involvement with suppliers and what they're doing is going to become ever more important, given sort of mandates. I guess that's going to be quite a resource-heavy task for trust, estates and sustainability people to deal with.
It is, and I'm still hopeful that given the slippage on the target, that maybe there is something going on in the back pocket of the team in charge of that, and maybe they are considering a central database. Realistically speaking, there is huge overlap in suppliers within individual trusts, and it doesn't make financial sense for individual trusts to be going out to every supplier to try and create this information. We hold a database based on the people we've helped along this journey already, and there is significant overlap. Multiple trusts using the same supplier. So it would make more sense for this to be a central exercise outside of individuals, at least for getting it started, and to have a database people can check on for their main suppliers. I think there will still be a lot of work to be done in the procurement team. And again, if you've got a dedicated person to sustainability, actually going out and asking all your suppliers, do you have a CRP? And let me tell you what it is if you don't, isn't a huge cost, but you have to have accounted for the cost of that person and found that person before you get there.
Thank you. Somebody else has said, I'm aware of the NHS's Sustainability Leadership for Greener Health and Care programme. Are there any other training courses for estates personnel you can recommend?
There's quite a lot here. Now, I'm trying to think who I can and can't. I think I might have to take that offline, but I'm open, Richard, to talking to you about some of the things we send our people on. If you want to contact us through HEJ afterwards around that. And again, it might be something we dip into in more detail at a later point. Sustainability training is really crucial, and there's not as much high quality training out there as I'd like. A lot of it is actually focused on postgraduate courses. So short courses, distance learning from universities, but there are some things that you can do quicker that you can look at.
On a different theme, somebody said, why is adaptation suddenly being discussed so much, and how does it change the approach to sustainability?
Yeah, this was a wild card really for me, that they included so much about adaptation within this new document. It's because of this legal guide. It's because of what happened last year in terms of that coming out in June. So now what you're seeing is a little bit of a panic to say, actually, have we considered any of this? The reason it's come to the fore so quickly is essentially last summer and the summer before, and how many trusts struggled with actually just keeping their care conditions to an acceptable level. And I think that's brought to a little bit of panic in around the backlog in terms of maintenance, and around whether vent systems are up to scratch, and around just the physical condition of buildings. Whether there's any funding behind that that's going to actually help you to fix it is a bigger question.
Thank you. Another factual question. Is there a consistent methodology used by trusts to measure and update their estate carbon baseline?
Not really. So there is the central carbon sort of footprint that you will have received, and that's been done centrally from a data pool. It doesn't very well capture certain things, and I know some of you have given feedback on that to the team already. We use industry standards, which is based again on the guidance that is there for public sector as well. So the wider guidance that's come out from the government for the public sector in general, and we apply it to the scope of the NHS footprint and Footprint Plus. We don't generally offer the Footprint Plus because it's outside of our usual remit. But when it comes to the NHS carbon footprint, we have a standard methodology that we use, which is essentially just industry standard that is used across all sectors.
Thank you. One other question now. You've been on maternity leave, I know, for a year. What surprised you most on returning in this area, and did it give you a different perspective on where things are now with trusts and their green plans?
Yeah, I think some of you have probably been on my webinars before, have noticed that I've been a little bit more factual today. I've given you a lot of information, a lot of data. Usually it's a bit more discussion that we talk about, and it's a little bit more woolly. I think I've come back and I've looked at the lack of progress, because I do think that's a fair thing to say. There's not been as much progress as people wanted, and that's everyone's ambition to make progress seems to have been a little bit stalled. And I would say I'm a little bit more focused on it now. Previously, I spent a lot of my time looking at actually the basics of REGOs and energy supplies and what's the market doing, and you know, oh, how are your bills? Are your bills actually accurate? I spent a lot of time on that side of things before I went on maternity leave, and that's something that I've decided to step away from coming back. And my full focus now is on sustainability in the NHS and the public sector, and how we can actually start to make progress, even though you've got these huge obstacles to try and overcome.
Thanks, Beth. One other question we've had from several in the audience is, can they have a copy of your slides?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say there's probably not a huge amount of information on there you've not already got, but yeah, absolutely have a copy of the slides, and absolutely reach out. So as much as we are an external consultancy and we are not the NHS, our view is always that if someone's got a question we can help with, we will help. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me on email, probably not on phone because I'll be in and out of meetings, but yeah, reach out to everyone and just ask. And if we can put you in touch with someone else we know who knows the answer, we will.
Well, thank you very much, Beth. I think we've run a number of webinars with Inenco to date, and they've all been excellent. I think that was one of the best we've done in terms of the information that's come out from Beth on it. And I'd like to thank her for presenting in such detail, for having such comprehensive knowledge and answering the questions so well. One of the audience has actually said, "Thank you, Beth, that was brilliant," which is a nice summing up. So thank you very much, Beth, for presenting, and thank you to all our audience for listening. I hope you found it useful, and I think it was an excellent webinar. Thanks very much, and goodbye.
Well, thanks everyone. Bye.